Hello, my friends. This is the 1921 Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series, and today we will be finishing up the very long diary entry of the 15th of March, 1921. This will be part 14, and I don't think I've ever had another diary entry in this series that had to be broken down into 14 points. Maybe 10 or so. Okay, so I wanted to start out today with something a little different because I've been watching on YouTube a series of lectures on the theory of literature given by a Yale professor, Paul Fry, and I've only watched 3 of them so far, but he's been talking a little bit about Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, and I've always thought that Foucault was a little bit of a crank because of this idea he had that there really is no author to any kind of text, and what he said there was an author function, and that made no sense to me. But now I'm actually thinking he was ahead of his time, because what we have now with AI writing poetry and all kinds of texts, fiction, nonfiction, is precisely that. We do have an author function instead of an author. There is certainly an author involved, but he's sort of, he or she are relegating themselves to an author function and the AI to an author function. So I was thinking about that in terms of our friend Dmitri and what it would be like, what it will be like maybe in the future if you have people still keeping diaries, if they become, instead of diarists, they become diarist functions. So for instance, what if Dmitri had the ability to have an AI device of some kind with him that would record and listen to everything he did during the course of a given day, and then when he got home he could instruct it to fit it all within a certain number of words and to edit out anything embarrassing or anything that he thought might be boring for, say, his grandchildren when they went to read his diaries. And, if he had done that, and if other diarists do that in the future, would we know him better than we are getting to know him through his traditional diaries that he sat down and wrote for himself? I think we would probably know a lot more detail, and it would be more streamlined. But, I'm glad he lived when he did, and that he didn't do that. And but it's an interesting thing to think about. You may not agree, so if you considered that last little bit sort of a waste of time, I don't blame you. But I have one other thing that I want to talk about in relation to literature, and that's a quote from David Foster Wallace. "I cared what people thought about me until I realized they don't think about me." Well, of course, the novelist David Foster Wallace ended up killing himself, even though he was hugely successful. So maybe that's a red flag for us not to follow this principle of his. But on the other hand, I think of someone like Dmitri and his writing of his diaries, and I think it was important to him that after he was gone, that people would think about him. And royalty kind of gives you a leg up with that, doesn't it? Because even if you're a very minor royal, at least you're going to be a footnote somewhere, let alone one who was involved in a political assassination, for instance. But yeah, I think that was very important to him, that was one of the reasons he was doing this, even though at times he was being very frank, and you think, well, would you really want your posterity to read some of the things he's saying? But yeah, it was important to him that people would think about him. And so I'm glad we're doing this. Okay, so I've got all that off my chest, and here is our recap for the previous video. Dmitri, still in Berlin, had received an invitation to join something called the Russian National Assembly that I don't know anything about, but he described as a non-political group, basically a charity group that was for monarchists specifically. And yeah, so fine, good. But the other thing that he was asked, according to him, was to be a leader of the right-wing groups, is how he puts it. And so that's a little more ambiguous, and he said yes to that, but under the stipulation that nobody should know about it, and that he should not be regarded as a future Tsar of Russia. And in fact, George Graf tells us in his memoirs that they didn't want Dmitri to be their candidate for the throne. So maybe he misunderstood, and maybe this was just a matter of politeness on their part, and then again politeness on his part, because he said he didn't think that he could actually refuse it. The other thing is this idea of things getting out of hand when he was in Berlin, and who was to blame for that. And of course, he really wants to blame Galeevsky for that. Galeevsky, who was acting as a sort of adjutant to him, had done what Dmitri didn't want him to do and made a big deal of it with lots of fanfare. But at the end, he recognizes that the fault is really his, that he got caught up in the moment as much as Galeevsky did, and it was on him to set boundaries for Galeevsky from the beginning, and not to get caught up in it himself. So anyway, we are up to the question of our cast of characters for this section of the diaries, and it's a big change. This time we still have Galeevsky. We have the Berlin monarchists referred to simply as these people, and we have the star of this little concluding section, Marie-Louise, Dmitri's girlfriend, back in Copenhagen. Okay, so let's dive into that. Naturally, it was hard to leave Copenhagen. It made me sad to leave Marie-Louise. I'll never forget how I felt when I arrived in Berlin. Naturally, I was quickly struck by the huge contrast between the images I had formed of a possible private family life there in Denmark with Marie-Louise and the role I had to play during my 6 days in Berlin. It hit me right in the heart. And then, to make matters worse, Galeevsky inflated that role as much as he could and didn't take my personal feelings into account at all. And I had no friends whose shoulders I could cry on. And again, my whole being rebelled against this false role of pretender to the throne. Oh, if only all these people who are pushing me into this role knew how disgusted I am with it, and how I am drawn with all my soul to a private, non-political life. But now it's time to switch to a description of how I spent each day, otherwise I simply won't have space for anything else in these books. So by these books, of course, he means his diaries, and he means to say, of course, that if he spends all his time talking about his feelings, he won't ever have room for anything else in his diaries. Well, since this is part 14 of that section of the diaries, maybe he's right, but I nonetheless wish that he had done more of it anyway. Selfishly, I suppose, on my part. Okay, so what I like about this is that it strikes me from a literary perspective as a kind of watered-down version of Hamlet's question. It's not to be or not to be in the sense of, will I continue to live or will I end my life? It's to be a private man or not to be a private man, to be a private man or a public man. And maybe Dmitri is overestimating his options, because it's not necessarily the case that that role of public man is just laying there at his feet for him to pick up if he decides to. So we've already heard from Graf that they had decided in Berlin after Dmitri's trip that they had decided in favor of Kirill and backing Kirill's claim to be the emperor in exile. And I've also learned from Graf, reading a little more, that according to him, the liberal monarchists in Paris had also decided that Dmitri was not their man. And that would waver a little bit. In the 1930s, Milyukov, for one, would go back to being quite enthusiastic about Dmitri. Maybe just because looking around him, he saw that with Kirill, for instance, there was too much of the fascist association, and Dmitri, by conviction, was opposed to that. But anyway, Dmitri believed at this point that he had a choice. He could choose to be a private man, or he could choose to be a public man on the grand scale. And he's telling us that all of his inclinations, to the bottom of his heart, his whole soul, is to want to be a private man. So the question then is, do we believe him? Is he being disingenuous about this to himself? Does he believe that what he wants to be is a private man, when in fact he has by no means gotten over this lifelong desire that he's had to be a public man, to have a consequential role in politics and in the public eye, going back to Imperial Russia, when it was very, very frustrating to him to not be able to have such a role, because Grand Dukes by and large didn't have such a role, or if they did, it was merely as representatives of the Tsar and not developing their own ideas or that sort of thing. That wasn't allowed, so I'm not sure that I completely do believe him, although I do believe that he believes what he's saying. And in fact, after he does retreat into private life with his wife, Audrey Emery, he is still going to give way to that desire and to go out into the political sphere again. And then the question, as I've said so many times for me, is whether the man who was living out the rest of his life in a tuberculosis sanatorium, whether he still had that dilemma of to be a private man or to be a public man, and whether he thought there was any option left for him, and if so, that it was worth pursuing. Okay, so there's a part of him that, as much as I admire him for sticking to his convictions, there's still a part of him that's not quite grasping this whole thing, that he has to make this decision himself. He is not going to have it thrust upon him. The buck stops here kind of a thing. So he's getting to that. He's acknowledging that. He did acknowledge that in the previous diary entry, and he's kind of less acknowledging it now, because he's talking about how he's being pushed into this role that he doesn't want. Well, we've all felt like that, after all. We've all felt like there were certain things that we couldn't say no to, and that we were letting people push us into. And I'm sure that's quite legitimate that he felt that way. But, he's not telling other people what he thinks, quite apparently. He's not saying, I feel pressured. He's not saying, what I really want is to have a private life. And, he's outwardly making it seem like he's enjoying this, getting some attention and being taken seriously, because I think that's what was really at the bottom of his need to contemplate life as a public man, was the fact that he never felt like he was taken seriously, and he wanted that so much. But, it all seems to come down to this problem of not telling people how he feels. And so then there's this interesting remark that he says that in Berlin he had no friends whose shoulders he could cry on. So I take that to mean he had no friends who he could have a deep discussion with about this. and talk about his reservations and the things that he liked and the things that he didn't like and how he felt pressured. So who would have been the friends in his life that he could have talked to things like that about? Well, the biggest one, of course, was his sister, Maria. He was definitely a male chauvinist, but I think he would have taken what she had to say seriously, and she would have helped him develop his feelings and ideas about that. The other one who is back in Copenhagen is Olga. It's too bad Olga didn't come with him to Berlin, because Olga was a friend that he could have talked about these things with. And Sir Charles Marling, to a certain extent. Sir Charles was kind of a stuffed shirt, but he had Dmitri's best interests at heart, and they kind of had a father-son relationship. And even Ksenia's companion, Dolgoruki, was someone that he was able to confide to a little bit when he was in Copenhagen and talk about how he felt pulled in two different directions. But as he says, there's no one in Berlin that he can do that with, because apparently, as close as his relationship with Golevsky is, it's on a completely different footing. It's on a more business footing, you could say. So who is the person whose shoulder he's going to cry on when all of this goes terribly wrong? Well, it's no mystery, is it? It's Coco. It's Coco Chanel. She is going to fill that role, and very, very soon. Okay, so let's talk about the next time. We're not up to Coco just yet. We'll be doing the on-the-day entry for 1st March 1921. We'll start out in Copenhagen, and Dmitri will talk about who he sees and what he does that morning before he gets on the train. And then he'll be talking about this extraordinary arrival in Berlin, where he's really blindsided by all these people who turn out to see him, and the situation at the hotel. And he'll be naming names this time, so we'll find out exactly who was there to meet him. And I may have to split that one in two, because for one of the day-by-day diary entries, it's very, very long. He has a lot to say. But we'll see about that. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.